This week marks 15 years since Britain entered into the war in Iraq. Today is the next in our series, exploring the consequences of the conflict across the world. The BBC's Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen reflects on the legacy for the region as a whole.
In 2003, the US, Britain and their allies invaded Iraq and changed the politics and the balance of power in the Middle East. The consequences are still reverberating around the region. As they built up to war, their main justification was that Saddam Hussein's Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I listened in September 2002 to Tony Blair launching his Dossier in the House of Commons on what he said was Saddam's arsenal. We should believe it, he said, because it was based on the work of the Joint Intelligence Committee.
The intelligence picture they paint is one accumulated over the last 4 years. It is extensive, detailed, and authoritative. It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, including against his own Shia population, and that he is actively trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability.
I'd spent a lot of time in Iraq, and I believed the UN inspectors had destroyed Saddam Hussein's ability to make weapons of mass destruction. One of our drivers was conscripted into what was supposed to be the elite Republican Guard. When he'd bribed his way out, he told me the windows in the barracks didn't have any glass, and he'd bought meat for his comrades as a goodbye present. If it was that bad for an elite unit, I thought, could they really make weapons of mass destruction? But Mr. Blair was a skillful politician, and I started to wonder, what if he's right? In the end, he wasn't. There were no weapons of mass destruction. It took a while for true believers to realize it. At a party in Baghdad after the invasion, an American journalist told me the US military had told him secretly that key discoveries were being made. But they never were. I drove down to Basra in southern Iraq, where Mr. Blair was visiting victorious British troops who'd stationed themselves in one of Saddam's palaces. The Prime Minister was right about one thing. He told the British servicemen and women that the consequences of the war would resonate for years, though he believed the invasion would change the Middle East for the better.
When people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century. And you did it.
In Baghdad, I went to the former palaces of Saddam that had been requisitioned, this time by the Americans. One of them still had a roof adorned with busts of Iraqi heroes, all of whom looked like Saddam. Inside were people who believed they could remake Iraq and, once they'd finished, do the same again in other Middle Eastern countries. They remade Iraq, but not in a good way. The Iraqi state and the military were thrown into the dustbin of history. Anyone who'd been in Saddam's former ruling party, the Ba'ath, was sacked, though it was effectively compulsory to join it, even to get a low-level job in the civil service. Changes of regime in Iraq over generations had often been bloody. What was different after 2003 was that actions by the occupying powers made matters much worse. It wasn't just the level of killing that might have been expected after a coup. The invasion was much more disruptive. It set off seismic changes that broke Iraq and rumbled around the Middle East. The Americans destroyed the state without having anything to replace it, so law and order broke down. Life became insecure and violent for millions of people. Iraq became a magnet for extremists. Saddam Hussein had terrorized his country, but he didn't tolerate the presence of jihadists. The Americans didn't have enough control to stop them. A particularly unsavory Al-Qaeda affiliate was established. Later, it moved to Syria and renamed itself ISIS, and then Islamic State. The chaos in Iraq after the invasion gave it the chance it needed to get established and to start killing. Religious sectarianism had been a fact of life in the Middle East for a long time. Islam split into Shias and Sunnis as the result of wars over who'd succeed the Prophet Muhammad after his death in 632. But it had worked at a low level in the 20th century, particularly since Arab republics were mostly in the hands of largely secular authoritarian rulers. After 2003, sectarianism was reborn. Part of it was fear spread by the violence in Iraq and the growth of jihadist groups. Unscrupulous leaders also used it to scare and rouse the masses, just as nationalism had been used in Europe in the 20th century. The invasion also fueled the growing conflict between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran. It's now one of the greatest drivers of instability in the Middle East. Saddam was a Sunni leader who was Iran's enemy. Once he'd been removed and elections held, the majority Shia community gained power and Iraq slipped into the Iranian orbit. Iran's new influence alarmed its Sunni Arab neighbors, especially Saudi Arabia. The Iran-Saudi rivalry helped fuel war in Syria. They supported opposite sides. It continues to be hugely destabilizing and is a major reason for the war in Yemen. The Iraq experience also had a profound effect on the American and British response to the war in Syria. In the first few crucial years of the war, it stopped them sending significant military aid to rebel groups fighting the Assad regime. Those groups were desperate for an alliance with Western powers, and when they couldn't make progress, they lost out to a galaxy of extremist Islamist groups, up to and including Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. One more consequence of the invasion of Iraq, and probably a good one: Washington and London lost their desire to invade enemies to impose regime change. When war started in Syria, they had no desire at all to send in their own troops. I'm not blaming the invasion for everything bad that has happened in the Middle East. Governments and individuals bear responsibility too. The region was unstable and at times violent before 2003. What I am saying is that the invasion was a seismic event that created new fault lines and reopened old ones in a complex map of rivalries and weaknesses. And the aftershocks continue.